Welcome, everybody, to episode 1 of the Waterfowl Management Podcast. We've been talking about doing this for a long time, and it finally made its way front and center. We're past turkey season. We're past planting season, kind of. It became time for us to put this one back to the front burner. I'm excited, joined as always with my dad, Mike, and our longtime friend, Dan Krigler. If you followed along with our WMA stuff at all, you're well acquainted with all of us. We probably won't spend too much time on introductions today, but I hope if you stick with us, you'll continue to get introduced. So, topic for the day, this first series that we're going to do, we felt like it would be good to kind of go back to the fundamentals. It's sometimes we get in the weeds of these advanced topics that are super interesting and fun to talk about, but they're not always what everybody needs. And everybody, like a good athlete, you got to go back to your fundamentals all the time. And I was shooting my bow earlier today. It comes back to how you release. It's not always the big stuff. And so over the next 4 or 5 episodes, what we're going to do is we've come up with what we believe are the 5 attributes or the 5 pillars of every highly functioning, highly performing wetland. And so we thought about, when we were developing this, what we discussed were all the farms and all the properties, private and public, and what attributes do they share? What do they all have in common? And so it all came back down to pretty much 5 pillars. And so we're going to dedicate one episode to each one of those and really try to dive deep on those fundamentals. And so if anybody's struggling and not seeing the results that they want on their property, likely it's probably going to be able to be covered under one of these, and we can see where those weaknesses lie on each property. So the first one, absolutely going to be the number one pillar all the time. It doesn't matter. You don't have this one. All the rest of them are pointless usually. So we're going to discuss water control today. And that means water on, water off. How do we deal with it? And hopefully it's not just Mother Nature at the whim of Mother Nature. Hopefully we can have some influence over when we have water and when we don't, and all those things like that. So with that being said, Danny, I'm going to go right to you. Tell us what water control, what it means.
Well, it's like you stated, Cale, it's definitely one of the main pillars that you need to think about. Water on, water off, control water situation, control drainage, independent flooding, so you don't have to rely on runoff or backup or anything that from rivers. You can have a system in place, which will be part of your development design initially, where you've got adequate water to flood over time the acres that you want to at the depth you want to. So water's huge. I mean, it's obviously it's one of the main components you need to consider. There's a lot of help out there to get to where you want to be. Don't hold back. Don't be conservative. Lay out what you want. Get it designed that way to meet your goals, and you're going to be a lot happier if you get it close to where you want it to be. One thing about water is, and we've talked about this before, but water is key for managing the habitat, the plants that you want, the desirable plants for waterfowl that you want. And so there's a combination of things that you need for managing those plants, but the first thing is water. So that's a critical component of any wetland complex. So those plants then equate to food, nutrition. Water can be used initially to draw down, to create the plants you want. It can be used to irrigate, to promote more growth, more seed production. There's so many things that water can do for you. So you optimize your habitat. You optimize the food resources. You can distribute cover, based on that growth from water across the scope or the area of your marsh, so that you can provide that interspersion of open water and cover that you need for waterfowl that's the most desirable. So those really are really the positive things. The water in, you flood the water when you want to time it with migration. Maybe you want to flood a little bit later. Maybe you want to flood a little earlier for early teal season, early migrants, waterfowl and waterbird migrants. Maybe you want to flood it a little bit later to capture more of the mid to later part of migration. So you have that timing at your disposal with water. And also then with your drawdown, you're using water to draw it down at the times that you need to encourage those plants. Kind of going back in a circle here now to what I talked about starting out. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm sure Michael has some really good ideas and thoughts on this. So But that's kind of kicks us off.
Yeah, I'll be fairly similar to your thoughts on a lot of that, I'm sure, Danny. But I think when I think of water control for a wetland, it really means the ability to put water on and take water off of that property in a very timely basis. It's when you need to do it. Several things Danny just talked about are talking about just that, having the ability to pull that water off when you need to get the plant responses you need to, or even in the case of maybe some maintenance issues or repairs you got to do. There's a whole host of reasons why you might want to do that. But I think the key thing, if you're designing the perfect situation, you want to have the ability to put water on quickly and to get rid of water quickly. And again, why would you want to put water on quickly? Well, again, in an ideal world, you don't necessarily have to. But if you get into a situation where all of a sudden you look at the weather and you see a big weather front coming and you need to bump your unit up 2 or 3 tenths to bring in some new food, having that ability to actually impact that water level on a short-term basis is very beneficial. Doesn't mean if you don't have that capacity that you're out of luck or anything like that, because a lot of times you're going to be limited by certain things. But from my perspective, I guess just looking at it, thinking, okay, if I had the ideal opportunity to control water, what would that mean? It would be able to put water on when I want, take water off when I want.
No, I completely agree. And from my perspective, a lot of it comes back to resources. And none of this that we're talking about is a cheap endeavor. And so when we're thinking about flooding a wetland, there's a choice, right? And some people go on just give me what I need to get by. And then some people go, all right, I need the biggest and the best and possible. And so probably it falls in that somewhere in the middle ground of what you can afford and what you need. And so I always think of this as a process of like, you know what, maybe you start somewhere where you've got some infrastructure that's okay, and then you build up to something like that. I think the point of this episode that I want to make sure we hit on is this is where the investment needs to be at the beginning, other than developing the place. But like water should be one of the very first and primary considerations. Like you guys, we can't move water on and off when we want, and we can't do a whole lot of other things either. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the beginning. So tell me about the difference a little bit of what you guys have seen in respect to what happens when you cannot control water, and probably more so on the way out, when you cannot pull water off.
Yeah, I'll jump on that right quick. Controlling water, if you can't control that water, the first thing in a wetland environment, what you're going to start noticing, you're going to quickly see your plant response become dominated by plants that you don't probably really want in your wetland. Some of them will be okay, but they just aren't going to be the food producing plants that we want to target for waterfowl based kind of management. And so when you start out without having that water control where you can get that water off when you need to, those sites just stay wet and they become perennial plants, basically your perennial smartweeds, your willows, which again, willows and some of the buttonbush and some of that stuff can have some really good value as well. But when you lose control of that water going out, you start losing control of your plant community that you're targeting.
Yeah, I've witnessed that. It was a 250 acre tract on a private wetland, and these guys got stuck. They couldn't drain the water. The Mississippi came up. They couldn't drain the water off, so the water stayed. And there was 250 acres of cattails.
Yep.
And they came to me and they said, what are we going to do? Well, the Mississippi came down and we made a plan. So we started to chip away those cattails, mowing, disking, ground disturbance. We eventually got to a mosaic later in the season. We actually had a millet response in August, which was surprising. It wasn't very tall, but it was all over the place and good seed production. So we had some openings. We chipped away at it. We got into it. And eventually in 2 years, we had this beautiful mosaic of cattails and moist soil because the Mississippi, they timed their drawdowns then with more to evacuate water sooner, still taking into account spring migration, but getting the water out so the Mississippi, there wasn't as much of a chance as it coming up. So anyway, long story short, I told them, I said, with water control, with the way you guys are managing here, these cattails are going to go away. They're going to disappear because you're going to manage for drier. Your water drawdowns are going to be sooner, drier, and eventually they did. Probably a year or two, the cattails went away. But that's the extreme part of, if you don't have control over the water, what can happen? Just like Michael said, vegetation that you don't want completely takes over, and it may take a little while to get it worked out of the system. One thing that I think, one situation that you can all think about and react to and maybe respond to in your situation, we had a situation on a public area I was managing, and it was all cockabur. Okay, so the water came off too quick, came off too fast. We didn't do a very good job with the drawdowns. We brought the water off because we were trying to plant crops there as well. So we were kind of prioritizing. And so anyway, it came off quick. We had cockabur. So I went in there and disc everything down late in the growing season. This was in mid-July or, about there. And then we irrigated it. So here we used water again to irrigate, not much, just to saturate the soil. And we got panic grass and sedges, and the teal went crazy that fall in these areas. We punched holes in it. The birds really utilize it. So there's, again, water is, is so important. And that's some of the, if you don't manage it correctly, it can cause some challenges for you. But if you do manage it correctly, it can really set the table for you.
So, Danny, I'd be curious on that property there. What was the water source? And was it a strong water source where you could do that quickly and then get the water off again pretty quickly? Or what was the water source coming from?
The water source was an electric pump with a well. And so it was very quick to get to the area. We had the swales and the connections to get the water there quickly. We didn't even have to put any depth in it at all. We just saturated it because we wanted to see what was going to happen. And it was late in the summer, so it was going to dry out. It wasn't a heavy clay soil like gumbo or anything. It was pretty light soil. I mean, would hold water certainly, but it dried out fairly quickly after it was saturated. But I could just see that stuff coming up. That germination was about 7 to 10 days. So you could monitor what's coming up. It's like, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. There's grasses, there's sedges, and then when they came up and started making seed heads, and you could definitely tell what it was. So it was a quick flush of water. And, maybe one of these episodes we could talk more about these watershed wetlands and stuff, because I know everybody doesn't have the capability and the resources to have wells and pumps. And so we're kind of leaning into that more than anything, more dependable water, whether you have diesel or electricity to pump with. But if for those that have those resources, you've got a lot of help at your fingertips with water as a management tool.
Yeah, I'll throw out another quick example of water control, and we may get into this later as well, Cal, but how water control goes wrong. And one of those, again, coming back to the public area that I managed for several years, we had a 42-inch drain pipe that drained 2,800 acres of water, and that was a bottomland timbered unit. And needless to say, after the Mississippi River flood, summer flooding, and water stayed on the area for months on end and actually never did completely drain the first year. And that set off a chain reaction over time of all of those trees just steadily dying off. Year after year, they were more and more and more dying, and led to a whole nother problem when then we had reed canary grass come in and took over all of those areas and got established to the point that it was about the only thing growing. And so another extreme case of how water management can go wrong in a hurry. And it was just inadequate infrastructure, and it was infrastructure that had been there for decades, and so just had to hit the right timing, the right scenario of flooding events and inability to get rid of that water. And it just completely altered the landscape after that in terms of habitat. So a lot of examples of how water, it is the crucial factor to a wetland, I think, without question. But certainly water off can be a really big problem for us in many different ways.
So I know we're kind of jumping ahead in our set here. You brought up the area, and I'd like to ask you about that, because you also redesigned that. You also took that area and said, okay, this infrastructure is clearly not working and clearly not what we need. So what kind of decisions went into saying, okay, this is what we need? And what did you walk through in that case?
The whole area was about almost 7,000 acres. And so there was a lot tied to it that was not in that impacted area, at least not impacted in the same way. We had a lot of development in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s that had addressed some of those issues on the upper part of the area, but the drainage on the bottom end of the area is what really got us in trouble, I think. And so basically we went back in with a full uh, kind of a study on most of our options with the Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Missouri Conservation, and came up with a restoration plan where we had several team meetings. Everybody kind of weighed in and put their thoughts into it, and we all came around to the same thought: is that we had this one big unit that had several feet of variation in elevation across it from top to bottom, and had only one 42-inch pipe for that water to get out, which was our really big bottleneck. And so then we just designed a new system for that whole part of the area. And in the end, that ended up being, I think, like what, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6-foot structures. I think instead of one 42-inch pipe, we had 6-foot structures to open and close to let water in or out. And then also maybe a 5-footer, I think, again. So we drastically changed that infrastructure, if you will, so it would be we could be capable of handling those river floods. Mississippi River is going to flood. We know that. So we have to plan on it. We also built into that the ability to back flood through that. So we would have a lot less infrastructure damage done from water blowing through levees and things like that. Now that still happens, floods come on very quick at times and you just can't adjust for it. But in those cases, we have the best infrastructure we could get at the time for sure. And so,
No, I was going to add, Kale, and this is on a much smaller scale Michael was dealing with, but if I can drain a unit in 3 days, have the right pipe size, have everything that I need to drain it in 3 days, that usually takes care of everything that I need. If I can drain it 3 days, it's going to dry out fairly quickly. I've already captured maybe the drawdown that I want. Well, let's say we get a big influx of rain. I want to drain it. I want to get it out of there because now I've already set the table. I don't need water in it. I can drain it 3 days. I can repair any infrastructure I need to repair, and I can dry it out if I have undesirables that I want to deal with. So, and this is just an observation over time. It's not a magical number that I'm coming up with, but if I can drain in 72 hours, I can tackle just about anything.
No, I like that. And I think part of this conversation too is working yourself to a point where your infrastructure is at a point where it gives you that full gamut of, do I want to bring it off fast? Great, I can. May not have to, may not want to, but I can if I need to. And so the infrastructure and the way these things are designed and in the beginning is such a huge piece of that, because it really affects everything that you can do. And it might be 2 inches of dirt that prohibits you from a great result and a terrible one. And I have some examples here for the end to talk about where 2 inches of dirt, ruins stuff. But like it's just those simple things where having the infrastructure to allow you to make those choices: water on quickly, water off quickly if you have to, and then the micro adjustments kind of in between. Your comment brought up something in my mind too that I've always noticed about things that you had your hand in. So nothing on that end of the area is a straight line. And I'm sure there's several reasons to why, but talk about why.
Yeah, I think what it really boils down to is using the natural land features that were there. There was ridge and scale topography throughout that whole section. And so we tried to tap into that. Any kind of levees that we did build in there, we broke that unit out from 1 unit into 3 units to get, based on the elevations, what we needed to manage those 3 different units at. And again, when you got 4 foot of elevation difference across a wetland, that's quite a bit. And so by breaking that down, using those high ridges and natural topographical features out there, we were able to minimize the amount of dirt we had to move on those levees and in order to get that accomplished. But yeah, I think that's the natural thing. In most environments, we don't see Mother Nature work in straight lines. Usually there's curves and humps and ditches and everything else, and so that's what we looked at doing. Just try to make it look as natural as possible. And even in the early history of that portion of the area, that was kind of being designed for some rice farming is what I understood years ago, and then they never got it to that point before the federal government purchased the property, I guess. And so that topography was going to be used in that point too for the rice farming, but kind of lost my train of thought on that where I was going with that whole point. But again, to answer your question, it's really about using that natural topography and building off of that. We used natural drainages within the area to move the water from pump stations all the way through all three of the pools that we designed. So those followed the actual natural drainages that were there before we started doing development, and that made it more efficient for the flooding purposes when we wanted to put water on it, and for the drawdown purposes when we wanted to pull the water off of it.
The cool thing about that too, I can't help but throw this in. All the things that Michael was doing there on ridge and swales, that technology and that thought process has been scattered throughout the country. It's also been widely used in Missouri to modern times, and it's extremely beneficial for habitat purposes. You get different elevations, different depths, different vegetation, different plants, different nutrition that you're providing in those different zones. You're taking even some of those the swale effect, and you're using some of that for habitat mounds, higher dirt above the water surface that the birds actually love to loaf on. I mean, they'll just absolutely loaf on it and love it. And there's some other benefits with local resident species, amphibians, reptiles use that habitat as well. So anyway, I just had to make the habitat comment on some that Michael was talking about.
Yeah, I grew up listening to you talk about this, so I see it all the time. But when we were looking at developing a field, for at the farm that we spend a lot of time on, you drew a map, and it may not have been followed the way you wanted it drawn up, but I remember the rendering that you had, and it was created in a way where when we were borrowing for the levees, it wasn't just a ditch right next to the levee and we moved it over here and did that. It was like a feathering everywhere. And so that would drain well. And so talk a little bit about, I guess my question in that is like, is that a general rule where you could look at almost any farm out there and say, okay, this is probably where the natural water wanted to come, and this is where Mother Nature wanted this to be like, and can we enhance that and make that easier?
Yeah, and I think the key to any of that, like you said, in the early stages of development, what you would want to do is look at that field, look at the unit that you're laying out, and try to pick out that natural topography that exists already. There's almost always going to be some of that. Not, in today's world, there's stuff that's laser graded and everything else. So that, there may be some truly flat spots out there in the environment. But if it's a more of a natural landscape still in terms of the topography, it's going to have some high spots and some low spots. And a lot of times, if you look at enough older photos, old maps, you'll start picking out some of those features. You'll be able to see a spot that looks like that's always been wetter than the other parts of the area. And so you start incorporating that with your design, and you're going to be more successful. Water's going to follow that, historical line that it did before. Going to hold water better in some of those spots than you might hold in other places. And so you're less likely to run into problems with maybe hitting a sand lens or any kind of thing like that when you're doing your development. And so, yeah, just always look at that natural topography that's out there and look at as many older pictures and maps as you can. Try to pick out those features the best way you can. And then, when you do go in, you're going to do some grading to develop some berms and levees and stuff to hold the water where you want. So go in and try to tie into the high spots with your levees, and then also try to use your borrows in order to create those drainages that you need. Use that natural slough out through the middle and tie it into the low points that you want to tie it to with your drainage, and get your elevations where you want, so you can drain that unit out nice and quickly and still keep it looking like a natural wetland, not a unit full of ditches.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think those swales that you're referring to, Michael, I mean, you're talking about if you're doing a 60 to 100-foot swale, you're connecting it to the low spot, that natural occurring low spot that you might have on your property, or maybe it's an adjoining property. Maybe you look at a bigger scale on pictures on historical aerial photos, and you're picking up your neighbor with this slough, but it stops at your place. Maybe it was converted a long time ago or whatever, but you can recreate that, connect it kind of back to where it was. And so there's, you think about a 60 to 100-foot swale, it's a low spot that you're connecting it to a drainage, to a pipe that you're going to use for moving water out and managing that swale. That's a huge habitat feature right in the center, more than likely, instead of stuck up against a levee, or that where birds really aren't going to use that much. They like being out in the middle. So you've got this big swale out in the middle that you connected to the lowest point where you drain water off, and it becomes pretty magical for those birds, when they're looking at low spots through the migration as an initial point to land. You also can get mapping information if you're not very handy with that. USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, you can go there. They're public servants just like any federal agency, so they should offer you assistance on looking at those maps. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners Fish and Wildlife program, also they have biologists that they'd be more than happy to help you look for low spots or natural features that would be great wetland areas or areas you can enhance. And then your state biologists with any state, they should offer assistance as well. So that's all good stuff.
So kind of switching gears, it's easier to build a house from scratch than it is to renovate one. It's easier to, build a wetland from scratch than it is to probably renovate one. But that's probably not the reality for most people that end up with one. A lot of times you're buying something or you're entering a situation where something's already been developed. In our part of the world, it seems like there was a ton of wetland reserve program properties developed, and some of these are starting to be kind of renovated, restored to what they maybe were intentionally supposed to be in the beginning. What do you do? How do you approach water in one of those situations? Like if you guys were going to walk onto it today and say, okay, I'm going to try to manage that, in the future, what are you looking at? What are you looking for? And how do you assess it?
My first thought on assessment is, again, in that situation, probably water off. And I can't help but think about doing enhancements. That's the first thing that comes to mind. What do I need to do to make this thing work? What do I need to do to optimize it to make it the best it can be for my goals and my objectives for that site? And so that's when I go out and start reaching out for professional help in especially financial resources, if that's something that you need, or just technical expertise, bouncing ideas off of an expert, a local expert, whether it's USDA, whether it's federal, state. Maybe it's a neighbor that has done that kind of work. You invite them over and say, hey, man, I noticed you're doing some really cool stuff. How did you get there? What did you do? I'm having problems here. Share with neighbors, learn from others. But on things like that, they weren't well designed in the first place. They haven't been maintained very well. There's a lot of issues and challenges that you need to identify, and there's a lot of people that don't know how to identify all that stuff. So that's I just think about enhancements, making improvements, and reaching out to those that might offer some good knowledge for you to start with.
Yeah, I think I'll throw a thought or two on that as well. And I think one of the things I would mention, and it would be for either new development or restorations, either one. And I think that's, don't get in a hurry. Take some time, take your time and look at a piece of property and do an assessment on it. And actually, okay, what is working, what's not working, and maybe that's go through a waterfowl season, and see, okay, what are my constraints here? What do I need to improve? Where are the problems, and what are my options? Danny kind of mentioned several different avenues to get help and get direction, but it's really good to have some of that information if you're not already familiar with that property and what those problems or constraints might be. I think it's really good to take some time and use that to your advantage so you can develop the most well thought out best plan that you can. And that would be for new development or for a restoration. And I think that is a good point to bring out too. if you have a piece of property that maybe is, say it's a WRE easement property and has already been developed years ago, there's quite frequently anymore you hear about some funding options for restoration efforts on those properties. So go visit with your in Missouri, it'd be one of your WETS team members maybe, or any of the NRCS staff assigned to that, and get some information on it. There could well be some opportunity for funding there that you may not be thinking about as well.
Absolutely. No, I resonate a lot with the concept of not getting in a hurry, because I personally learn by doing, not by anything else. And so I just need to go out and see it and experience what's going on before I can really understand about what to do. And so you see that everybody's excited about it. The first thing everybody wants to do is put a pit in the ground, which is like great, but we got to be focused on lots of other things first. And so it comes back to, where do you spend your money? And the first thing is water on, water off. Controlling that water is never going to be a bad investment in the wetland world. And so my question, I guess, coming out of that is, talk a little bit about some of the smaller things that people can do to make sure that they're prepared for maybe the coming year. About what can I check, what can I look at, what can I make sure. I have some examples of areas that we've fallen short so far this year, but anything that comes to mind as good preventative maintenance.
Like always, one of the easy things to do is to figure out where your water off problems might be this time of year. If you're looking at it from right now, if you still have water being ponded out there, those are places that you need to be identifying. It's like, okay, when I get dry enough to get that out of there, what do I need to do? And maybe that means go in and run a PTO ditcher through there and put a 6-inch ditch in that, or maybe it's take a front loader on a tractor and move out the remnants of an old beaver dam that's holding it in there. There's several different things could be there, but again, go out there and look at it, see what it is that's causing your problems, and make a quick plan to fix those. This time of year, hopefully, in our part of the world, it's been fairly wet, still pretty wet, but other parts are pretty dry. I know I've talked to some folks in Arkansas, and they're getting some rain, but they're certainly not wet by any means there right now, at least not in the areas I've been talking to people. And so, take advantage of those dry conditions. But before you get to that dry condition, you need to know what your problems are and how you're going to address it. So,
one of the things that I've experienced so far this year, we put in a few food plots early, and I don't think we have a single one of those that's fared very well with the quantity of rain we've gotten. But what that also was able to show us is that there's a couple places that just need a little dirt work, and we wouldn't have lost a few of those plots. A 10 or 20 foot section of about a foot of dirt would have absolutely let those drain. And what that comes back to is, when you develop it in the first place, you think about that and make sure that there's not going to be permanent spots that hold water. And then as time goes on, and make sure that those are kept up with, because a lot of times we let willow trees grow up and the ditches silt in and maybe the way they once were, and things don't drain as efficiently as they do. And so we just try to slowly work on those as we can. It's never going to be perfect, but you got to hedge your bets and try to get it as close as you could possibly get it.
So one of the things that comes to mind on preventative maintenance is some of the area that I'm managing now has they've utilized some rice levees of the rice levee plow, and this is not rice country. It's just it's a internal levee system that was meant to capture water unit by unit, stage flooding, but it just doesn't work very well. Once you have infrastructure in place, make sure you check the freeboard on everything. I mean, it's going to tell you if it busts a levee and starts flooding deeper where you don't want it. That's what it told us this past fall. So we had to go back and fix those, put that dirt back on there to give you enough freeboard to hold water, so that when we do flood this fall, we've got enough freeboard to handle it, because your pumping needs to match the amount of water that's coming in there, so it doesn't overtop it before it can spread out, throughout the area. So checking your levees, walking your levees, looking at freeboard, paying attention to that, in the fall as you're flooding. And then if you notice any breaks, you shouldn't have any because you should have planned for enough freeboard. But that's one thing that caught us and that's something that you need to address and fix for sure for maintenance for the following fall, is make sure you get that dirt back on there.
Something I want to throw out too, as we're getting close to wrapping up, is if you've got one of these properties and you've noticed these problems that are happening where you maybe can't pull water off as effectively as you might have wanted to, or get it on or to places as effectively as you might want to, and you have a property that's in a government program or any of those types of properties, there's numerous different ones, but they all have people that are specifically there to help you do those things or to tell you what you can and cannot do, or options that may or may not work. So if you're sitting there and I'm like, man, yeah, I really do have some of these issues, what do I do? I think that those folks would be the absolute first place to call to figure out what could you do, because I think that's always a great underutilized resource in my opinion.
And now you probably have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with many different federal agencies, state agencies, and Ducks Unlimited. I'm gonna give it to Ducks Unlimited. Now they have to go through a different process, but as far as direct access, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they have engineers, there's soil erosion experts. Within the Natural Resources Conservation Service, there's soil and water conservation districts in some states, in Missouri certainly. And so you can tap into all levels of expertise when it comes to everything a lot of what we talked about, size of pipes. You can talk to, how much water can I remove in a 72-hour period with this pipe size on this 40-acre unit? They have answers to all that stuff. So you can get some really technical help and assistance through them. They're very knowledgeable. They're state biologists and private land biologists that you can reach out to. There's the Partners Fish and Wildlife Program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have some outstanding expertise. They're across the country. So we do encourage you to reach out. I mean, you guys are taxpayers and they want to help. They actually do have the expertise to help you in a lot of cases. So don't hesitate. Reach out, call them, go see them, set up an appointment. Here's my list of questions I need your help with. So I encourage you to seek them out.
Absolutely. So, final question. So we've talked about water control, lots of different things about it today. Probably hit all these topics, but parting comment from both of you. What is it that you want people to take away from this conversation? And what is it that people should be thinking about? If you had one.
I have one thought, I guess, for me, water management, and I'm going to sum it all up, and that's water on, water off, everything. But water management for me is something there's always going to be options and things available to you. And so keep in mind, we're talking about some scenarios that we are familiar with that have been on the Mississippi River. Not everyone's going to have access to the Mississippi River to pump water out of. So for one, just be aware that there are many different ways of getting water for a wetland. Those can be through, ground well type systems, pumps, big river systems. They can be small river systems. They could be, lakes that you use to flood another wetland. I mean, there's a host of different ways. And so, it's nice to have that access to a lot of water when you want it and when you need it. And so if you're designing and developing a wetland, try to build that into it. Let's look at the water management options I've got, and let's maximize what I can get, whatever that might be. And then on the backside, make sure you have the drainage system set up right. And when you get ready to pull the plug, you don't want to figure out that you got a problem then. So make sure you do your homework, look at all that stuff, take some time, don't be in a hurry. The more time you spend looking at stuff and assessing it, the better product you're going to end up with in the end. I know going through that big restoration I talked about earlier, I couldn't get construction crews on the ground quick enough. But in the backside of that, I'm pretty happy that it took us several different stages to develop that, because you always figured out other things that made the rest of the project better. So,
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice, guidance, Michael. In my opinion, controlling water in and out is obviously that's kind of the easy button. So make it easy on yourself when you think about that. Don't be too conservative on getting that set up. And I had an engineer tell me in a big floodplain, he was telling me, he was a DU engineer, but as a matter of fact, he said, I will not put anything smaller than 15 inches in any of these restoration enhancement projects, period. Not saying we wouldn't go bigger, but he said we will never use a 12-inch pipe anywhere. It's all going to be at least, because there's trash that clogs these pipes up and so on. He had justification for it, but push the easy button on the infrastructure that you use, so it has a capacity, in your case, to draw the water down as fast as you want it to, so that you can do what you need to do. It gives you so much more flexibility. We didn't really get into water control structures. I'm sure we will in another episode. We'll talk about that in detail. But the controlling the water on and off maximizes your flexibility. It creates the habitat that you want, the plants that you want. It draws in the birds that you want. And so, set it up right the first time and focus on that component as one of your pillars. And you have a much better chance of being successful with your hunting program.
Awesome. So I think we're going to go ahead and call it there, but thanks for tuning in to the first episode of the Waterfowl Management Podcast. If you liked what we did today, please go ahead and check us out on our social media accounts, and go ahead and join the Waterfowl Management Academy, where if you need a question, you need help, we'll help you get to the right person if we don't know the answer. And we'll see you on the next one.